Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever suits to you at the very moment. Today's book for the audio read is entitled as Homo, Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. The writer of this book is Dr. Yuval Noah Harari, who is a PhD holder in history from the University of Oxford and now lectures at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specializing in world history. His books Sapiens and Homo Deus have become an international phenomenon. He encourages all of us, whatever our beliefs, to question the basic narratives of our world, to connect past developments with present concerns, and not to be afraid of controversial issues. One of the readers of the book, named Daniel Kahneman, says, "This book will shock you. It will entertain you. It will make you think in ways you had not thought before." So without further ado, let's get into the book. Chapter 1. The New Human Agenda. At the dawn of the third millennium, humanity wakes up, stretching its limbs and rubbing its eyes. Remnants of some awful nightmare are still drifting across its mind. There was something with barbed wire and huge mushroom clouds. Oh well, it was just a bathroom. Going to the bathroom, humanity washes its face, examines its wrinkles in the mirror, makes a cup of coffee, and opens the diary. Let's see what's on the agenda today. For thousands of years, the answer to this question remained unchanged. The same three problems preoccupied the people of 20th century China, of medieval India, and of ancient Egypt. Famine, plague, and war were always at the top of the list. For generation after generation, humans have prayed to every god, angel, and saint, and have invented countless tools, institutions, and social systems. But they continued to die in their millions from starvation, epidemics, and violence. Many thinkers and prophets concluded that famine, plague, and war must be an integral part of God's cosmic plan, or of our imperfect nature, and nothing short of the end of time would free us from them. Yet at the dawn of the third millennium, humanity wakes up to an amazing realization. Most people rarely think about it, but in the last few decades we have managed to rein in famine, plague, and war. Of course, these problems have not been completely solved, but they have been transformed from incomprehensible and uncontrollable forces of nature into manageable challenges. We don't need to pray to any god or saint to rescue us from them. We know quite well what needs to be done in order to prevent famine, plague, and war, and we usually succeed in doing it. True, there are still notable failures, but when faced with such failures, we no longer shrug our shoulders and say, "Well, that's the way things work in our imperfect world," or "God's will be done." Rather, when famine, plague, or war break out of our control, we feel that somebody must have screwed up. We set up a commission of inquiry and promise ourselves that next time we'll do better. And it actually works. Such calamities indeed happen less and less often. For the first time in history, more people die today from eating too much than from eating too little. More people die from old age than from infectious diseases. And more people commit suicide than are killed by soldiers, terrorists, and criminals combined. In the early 21st century, the average human is far more likely to die from binging at McDonald's than from drought, Ebola, or an Al-Qaeda attack. Hence, even though presidents, CEOs, and generals still have their daily schedules full of economic crisis and military conflicts, on the cosmic scales of history, humankind can lift its eyes up and start looking towards new horizons. If we are indeed bringing famine, plague, and war under control, what will replace them at the top of the human agenda? Like firefighters in a world without fire? So humankind in the 21st century needs to ask itself an unprecedented question. What are we going to do with ourselves? In a healthy, prosperous, and harmonious world, What will demand our attention and ingenuity? This question becomes doubly urgent given the immense new powers that biotechnology and information technology are providing us with. What will we do with all that power? Before answering this question, we need to say a few more words about famine, plague, and war. The claim that we are bringing them under control may strike many as outrageous, extremely naive, or perhaps callous. What about the billions of people scraping a living on less than $2 a day? What about the ongoing AIDS crisis in Africa or the wars raging in Syria and Iraq? To address these concerns, let us take a closer look at the world of the early 21st century, before exploring the human agenda for the coming decades. The biological poverty line. Let's start with famine, which for thousands of years has been humanity's worst enemy. Until recently, most humans lived on the very edge of the biological poverty line, below which people succumbed to malnutrition and hunger. A small mistake or a bit of bad luck could easily be a death sentence for an entire family or village. If heavy rains destroyed your wheat crop, robbers carried off your goat head, you and your loved ones may well have starved to death. Misfortune or stupidity on the collective level resulted in mass famines. When severe drought hit ancient Egypt or medieval India, it was not uncommon that 5 or 10% of the population perished. Provisions became scarce, transport was too slow and expensive to import sufficient food, and governments were far too weak to save the day. Open any history book and you're likely to come across horrific accounts of famished populations, driven mad by hunger. In April 1694, a French official in the town of Beauvais described the impact of famine and of soaring food prices, saying that his entire district was now filled with an infinite number of poor souls, weak from hunger and wretchedness and dying from want, because having no work or occupation, they lacked the money to buy bread. Seeking to prolong their lives a little and somewhat to appease their hunger, these poor folk eat such unclean things as cats and the flesh of horses flayed and cast onto dung heaps. Others consume the blood that flows when cows and oxen are slaughtered, and the offal that cooks throw into the streets. Other poor wretches eat nettles and weeds, or roots and herbs which they boil in water. Similar scenes took place all over France. Bad weather had ruined the harvests throughout the kingdom in the previous 2 years, so that by the spring of 1694 the granaries were completely empty. The rich charged exorbitant prices for whatever food they managed to hoard, and the poor died in droves. About 2.8 million French, 15% of the population, starved to death between 1692 and 1694. While the Sun King Louis XIV was dealing with his mistresses in Versailles. The following year, 1695, famine struck Estonia, killing a fifth of the population. In 1696, it was a turn or Finland, where a quarter to a third of people died. Scotland suffered from severe famine between 1695 and 1698, some districts losing up to 20% of their inhabitants. Most readers probably know how it feels when you miss lunch, when you fast on some religious holiday, or when you live for a few days on vegetable shakes as a part of a New Wonder diet. But how does it feel when you haven't eaten for days on end and you have no clue where to get the next morsel of food? Most people today have never experienced this excruciating moment. Our ancestors, alas, knew it only too well. When they cried to God, "Deliver us from famine," this is what they had in mind. During the last 100 years, technological, economic, and political developments have created an increasingly robust safety net separating humankind from the biological poverty line. Mass famine still strikes some areas from time to time, but they are exceptional, and they are almost always caused by human politics rather than by natural catastrophes. There are no longer natural famines in the world. There are only political famines. If people in Syria, Sudan, or Somalia starve to death, it is because some politician wants them to. In most parts of the planet, even if a person has lost his job and all of his possessions, he is unlikely to die from hunger. Private insurance schemes, government agencies, and international NGOs may not rescue him from poverty, but they will provide him with enough daily calories to survive. At the collective level, the global trade network turns droughts and floods into business opportunities and makes it possible to overcome food shortages quickly and cheaply. Even when wars, earthquakes, or tsunamis devastate entire countries, international efforts usually succeed in preventing famine. Though hundreds of millions still go hungry almost every day, in most countries very few people actually starve to death. Poverty certainly causes many other health problems, and malnutrition shortens life expectancy even in the richest countries on earth. In France, for example, 6 million people, about 10% of the population, suffer from nutritional insecurity. They wake up in the morning not knowing whether they will have anything to eat for lunch. They often go to sleep hungry, and the nutrition they do obtain is unbalanced and unhealthy. Lots of starch, sugar, and salt, and not enough protein and vitamins. Yet nutritional insecurity isn't famine, and France of the early 21st century isn't France of 1694. Even in the worst slums around Beauvais or Paris, people don't die because they have not eaten for weeks on end. The same transformation has occurred in numerous other countries, most notably China. For millennia, famine stalked every Chinese regime from the Yellow Emperor to the Red Communists. A few decades ago, China was a byword for food shortages. Tens of millions of Chinese starved to death during the disastrous Great Leap Forward, and experts routinely predict that the problem would only get worse. In 1974, the first World Food Conference was convened in Rome, and delegates were treated to apocalyptic scenarios. They were told that there was no way for China to feed its billion people, and that the world's most populous country was heading towards catastrophe. In fact, it was heading towards the greatest economic miracle in history. Since 1974, hundreds of millions of Chinese have been lifted out of poverty, and there are hundreds of millions more still suffer greatly from privation and malnutrition. For the first time in its recorded history, China is now free from famine. Indeed, in most countries today, overeating has become a far worse problem than famine. In the 18th century, Marie Antoinette allegedly advised the starving masses that if they ran out of bread, they should just eat cake instead. Today, the poor are following this advice to the letter, whereas the rich residents of Beverly Hills eat lettuce salad and steamed tofu with quinoa. In the slums and ghettos, the poor gorge on Twinkie cakes, Cheetos, hamburgers, and pizza. In 2014, more than 2.1 billion people were overweight, compared to 850 million who suffer from malnutrition. Half of humankind is expected to be overweight by 2030. Invisible armadas. After famine, humanity's second great enemy was plagues and infectious diseases. Bustling cities linked by a ceaseless stream of merchants, officials, and pilgrims were both the bedrock of human civilization and an ideal breeding ground for pathogens. People consequently lived their lives in ancient Athens or medieval Florence, knowing that they might fall ill and die next week, or that an epidemic might suddenly erupt and destroy their entire family in one swoop. The most famous such outbreak, the so-called Black Death, began in the 1330s somewhere in East or Central Asia, when the flea-dwelling bacterium Yersinia pestis started infecting humans bitten by the fleas. From there, riding on an army of rats and fleas, the plague quickly spread all over Asia, Europe, and North Africa, taking less than 20 years to reach the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. Between 75 million and 200 people died, more than a quarter of the population of Eurasia. In England, 4 out of 10 people died, and the population dropped from a pre-plague high of 3.7 million people to a post-plague low of 2.2 million. The city of Florence lost 50,000 of its 100,000 inhabitants. The authorities were completely helpless in the face of the calamity. Except for organizing mass prayers and processions, they had no idea how to stop the spread of the epidemic, let alone cure it. Until the modern era, humans blamed diseases on bad air, malicious demons, and angry gods, and did not suspect the existence of bacteria and viruses. People readily believed in angels and fairies, but they could not imagine that a tiny flea or a single drop of water might contain an entire armada of deadly predators. The Black Death was not a singular event, nor even the worst plague in history. More disastrous epidemics struck America, Australia, and the Pacific Islands following the arrival of the first Europeans. Unbeknown to the explorers and settlers, they brought with them new infectious disease against which the natives had no immunity. Up to 90% of the local populations died as a result. On 5 March 1520, a small Spanish flotilla left the island of Cuba on its way to Mexico. The ships carried 900 Spanish soldiers along with horses, firearms, and a few African slaves. One of the slaves, Francisco de Iquer, carried on his person a far deadlier cargo. Francisco didn't know it, but somewhere among his trillions of cells, a biological time bomb was ticking: the smallpox virus. After Francisco landed in Mexico, the virus began to multiply exponentially within his body, eventually bursting out all over his skin in a terrible rash. The feverish Francisco was taken to bed in the house of a Native American family in the town of Quimpoalan. He infected the family members who infected the neighbors. Within 10 days, Quimpoalan became a graveyard. Refugees spread the disease from Quimpoalan to the nearby towns. As town after town succumbed to the plague, new waves of terrified refugees carried the disease throughout Mexico and beyond. The Mayas in the Yucatan Peninsula believed that 3 evil gods, Ecpits, Azancac, and Suzacac, were flying from village to village at night, infecting people with the disease. The Aztecs blamed it on the gods Tezcatlipoca and Zipetotec, and perhaps on the black magic of the white people. Priests and doctors were consulted. They advised prayers, cold baths, rubbing the body with bitumen, and smearing squashed black beetles on the sores. Nothing helped. Tens of thousands of corpses lay rotting in the streets, without any daring to approach and bury them. Entire families perished within a few days, and the authorities ordered that the houses were to be collapsed on top of the bodies. In some settlements, half the population died. In September 1520, the plague had reached the Valley of Mexico, and in October it entered the gates of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, a magnificent metropolis of 250,000 people. Within 2 months, at least a third of the population perished, including the Aztec emperor Xitlahua. Whereas in March 1520, when the Spanish fleet arrived, Mexico was home to 22 million people. By December, only 14 million were still alive. Smallpox was the only first blow. While the new Spanish masters were busy enriching themselves and exploiting the natives, deadly waves of flu, measles, and other infectious diseases struck Mexico, one after the other, until in 1580 its population was down to less than 2 million. 2 centuries later, on 18 January 1778, the British explorer Captain James Cook reached Hawaii. The Hawaiian Islands were densely populated by 500,000 people who lived in complete isolation from both Europe and America, and consequently had never been exposed to European and American diseases. Captain Cook and his men introduced the first flu, tuberculosis, and syphilis pathogens to Hawaii. Subsequent European visitors added typhoid and smallpox. By 1853, only 70,000 survivors remained in Hawaii. Epidemics continued to kill tens of millions of people well into the 20th century. In January 1918, soldiers in the trenches of northern France began dying in the thousands from a particularly virulent strain of flu, nicknamed the Spanish flu. The front line was the endpoint of the most efficient global supply network the world had hitherto seen. Men and munitions were pouring in from Britain, the USA, India, and Australia. Oil was sent from Middle East, grain and beef from Argentina, rubber from Malaya, and copper from Congo. In exchange, they all got Spanish flu. Within a few months, about 500 million people, a third of the global population, came down with the virus. In India, it killed 5% of the population, 15 million people. On the island of Tahiti, 14% died. On Samoa, 20%. In the copper mines of the Congo, 1 out of 5 laborers perished. Altogether, the pandemic killed between 50 million and 100 million people in less than a year. The First World War killed 40 million from 1914 to 1918. Alongside such epidemical tsunamis that struck humankind every few decades, people also faced smaller but more regular waves of infectious diseases, which killed millions every year. Children who lacked immunity were particularly susceptible to them, hence they are often called childhood diseases. Until the early 20th century, about a third of children died before reaching adulthood from a combination of malnutrition and disease. During the last century, humankind became even more vulnerable to epidemics due to a combination of growing populations and better transport. A modern metropolis such as Tokyo or Kinshasa offers pathogens far richer hunting grounds than medieval Florence or 1520 Tenochtitlan, and the global transport network is today even more efficient than in 1918. A Spanish virus can make its way to Congo or Tahiti in less than 24 hours. We should therefore have expected to live in an epidemiological hell, with one deadly plague after another.